Hello, this is Mr. Smith, and in today's podcast, we're going to be going over the respiratory system. In this podcast particular, we're going to be going over the structure and just structurally how things are put together within the respiratory system. First thing we got to go over is what is the function. There's two functions of the respiratory system. The first function is gas exchange between the blood and the external environment, which occurs in the alveoli of the lungs. The second function would be the passageway for the air to get to the lungs. Basically, it just purifies, humidifies, and warms the incoming air. The organs of the respiratory system are the nose, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, the lungs, which include the alveoli. What we're going to do is we're just going to go over each one of these organs. So the first organ we'll go over is the nose. The nose is the externally visible part of the respiratory system. It contains the nostrils, which we refer to as nares. The inferior of the nose consists of what's called a nasal cavity. The nasal cavity is then divided by the nasal septum. At the roof of the nasal cavity are where the olfactory receptors are located, which help us with our sense of smell. The rest of the cavity is lined with what's referred to as a respiratory mucosa, which then moistens the air and also traps the incoming foreign particles. This respiratory mucosa also contains ciliary in it, which the ciliary kind of beats, and whenever there is anything trapped, any incoming particle which is trapped inside that mucosa, which could be bacteria or anything that's foreign getting in there, it will kind of contract or beat that cilia, will move it then towards the back of the throat, which we then swallow it and we digest it. The interesting thing is, though, is this cilia also becomes kind of slow or sloughs off when it's cold, which then explains why our nose is runny when it's cold outside, because that cilia is not working properly, and so some of that mucus then pours out of our nose, making our nose runny. The lateral walls of the nasal cavity have projections on them, which we refer to as conchae. And the conchae, all it does is increases surface area and also increases air turbulence within the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity is then separated by the oral cavity by the palate. The anterior part of the palate is referred to as the hard palate. The posterior part of the palate, which is referred to as the soft palate. Soft palate's made out of the muscle, hard palate's made out of bone. Containing in here also we have what's called the paranasal sinuses. Paranasal sinuses basically just surround the nasal cavity. There are the frontal, the sphenoid, the ethmoid, and the maxillary sinuses, which are located in the bone. They help to lighten the skull. They also help with speech pronunciation, and they also provide mucus to then drain into the nasal cavity. The next part, or the next organ we refer to is what's called the pharynx. The pharynx is the throat. The pharynx is divided into three regions. You have the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. The nasopharynx is the superior part, the oropharynx is the middle, and the laryngopharynx is the inferior. The oropharynx and the laryngopharynx are also commonly used not just for air, but for food passageway as well. The structure of the pharynx, we have tubes. We have a tube which connects the pharynx to the ear, or the inner ear, which is referred to as the pharyngotympanic tube. We also have tonsils in the pharynx. We have the pharyngeal tonsils, which are referred to as the adenoids, which are located in the nasopharynx. We have the palatine tonsils, and then we have the laryngeal tonsils, which are located in the oropharynx and at the base of the tongue. The next part, which is referred to as the larynx, otherwise known as the voice box. This plays a role in speech. It also, structurally, the larynx is put together by what's called thyroid cartilage. Thyroid cartilage is hard cartilage, and it kind of protrudes out anteriorly and forms your Adam's apple. The epiglottis, which is located at the top of the larynx, protects so that when we swallow, food doesn't go down the wrong pipe, is what we refer to, or it doesn't enter into our airway, which is the trachea. The pharynx, as we swallow, the epiglottis rises, which then forms a lid over the larynx, preventing food or any kind of foreign material to get in there, otherwise, except for air, of course. The vocal cords are also located in the larynx, which vibrate when air is expelled to create sound. The gap between the vocal cords is what's called the glottis. The next organ is the trachea, or the windpipe. The windpipe is about 4 inches long, and it contains C-shaped hyaline cartilage. It's pretty interesting that it's C-shaped. The reason why it is C-shaped is so that it allows, let me go to the next slide, so that it allows the esophagus to expand so that when we swallow food, it doesn't get stuck and we don't choke. That C-lined hyaline cartilage modifies, that trachea so that it will do that. The trachea also contains cilia in there, which kind of helps to expel things out of the windpipe or the trachea when you breathe in. It actually beats the opposite way as the air coming in, so that it can help to expel or get rid of that. Interesting fact is that when people smoke, what happens is the cilia, which is located in the windpipe, actually dies and goes away and quits. And so it's important that if a smoker's lungs look different than a normal person's lung that doesn't smoke, and it's because they're allowing all that tar and all that buildup to get inside of there. This is just a sagittal cut here of the human body, showing you kind of everything that we've kind of gone over so far. You can see the nose and the nares right here, which we then went to the nasal cavity. From the nasal cavity went to the pharynx, which we have the nasopharynx here. Here's the oropharynx, and here's the laryngopharynx. Right into here, here's your epiglottis, which shuts, allowing air to flow in here and not food to get stuck inside of your larynx, which is your voice box right here. This kind of line you can see there is the vocal cords, vocal folds, and then we went into your trachea. The next part is your bronchi. Your bronchi, what happens is the trachea actually divides, goes into the right and left lung. When it divides, we refer to this as your main or your primary bronchi. The right bronchi is wider, shorter, and straighter than the left. As the air continues on into the lungs, it divides even further from your primary bronchi. The next division would be your secondary bronchi, and then you have your tertiary bronchi, your bronchioles, your terminal bronchioles, and then it continues on even further. The next one would be your respiratory bronchioles, and then you have your alveolar sacs and alveolar ducts, which this is where gas exchange takes place. Everything from this point on, from your respiratory bronchioles to your nares, is actually just passageway. Has nothing to do with gas exchange. Gas exchange takes place in the alveoli itself, in those little sacs, which are located inside the lungs. The lungs, which takes up most of the thoracic cavity, except for, of course, right in the middle portion, which is where the heart is, which is the mediastinum. The apex of the lung is near the clavicle, whereas the base is near the diaphragm. Each lung is divided into lobes by fissures or grooves. The left lung has 2 lobes and the right lung has 3 lobes. The covering of the lungs, which is referred to as a serosa covering, which is on the outer surface of the lungs. There's 2. You probably remember this from future or from podcast first semester maybe, which we refer to as your pulmonary pleura or your visceral pleura, which covers the lung itself, and then you have your parietal pleura, which covers the walls of the thoracic cavity. Inside there we have that fluid, which allows for restriction of friction so that the lungs aren't rubbing up against the wall of the thoracic cavity. Also helps to prevent from that pleura from being pulled apart. This picture here, it just kind of blows it up a little bit so you can see the right and left lung. You can see the different lobes and so on. Well, that concludes our podcast for today on the structural part of the respiratory system. Thank you for watching, and you have a great day.